Hello. Let me take you quickly through a story with which I know many of you are familiar. But basically it's about how this all began. And it began when I was a very tiny little girl, born in England between World War I and World War II. And apparently from the time I could crawl, I was fascinated by animals. And the reason I'm going back to this period of time is because I had the good fortune to have an extraordinary mother. And I want to emphasize the importance of mothering and early experience. So when she came up to my room, I was 18 months old, and I don't remember this at all. But she says she came up and found that I'd taken a whole handful of earthworms to bed with me. Instead of saying, "Ugh, throw the dirty things out," she just said very quietly, "Jane, if you leave them here, they'll die, they need the earth," and we quickly took them back into the garden. But then what I do remember is a few years later, when I was somewhere between 4.5 and 5, and we lived in London, so it was a tremendous excitement for this animal-loving little girl, who really I was, limited to pigeons and the odd cat. We had a dog and sparrows and things like that. And we went for a week for a holiday in the country. And I met cows and pigs and horses, facing intensive farms, and the animals wandered about in the fields the way they should. So I was given a job, and that was to help collect the hens' eggs. And again, there were no nasty battery farms. The hens pecked around in the farmyard. And I was putting these eggs into my little basket, and you all know what a chicken's egg looks like. So apparently I began asking everybody, where does the egg come out of the hen? Because I couldn't see a hole like this. And obviously nobody told me to my satisfaction. So this is what I remember, seeing a hen climb up into her hen house. There were about 8 of these little wooden hen houses, where they slept at night, but they mostly went to lay their eggs in the little nest boxes around the edge. And thinking to myself, she's going to lay an egg. So I crawled after her. Well, that was a big mistake. And with squawks of, I suppose, fear, she flew out. And I remember thinking, this is now an unsafe place, and going into an empty hen house and hiding in straw in the corner and waiting. And waiting, and waiting, which was fine for me, but my poor family didn't know where I was. So they were searching, and you can imagine how nervous my mother was, because here was her little girl, and it was getting dark, and where was I? But when she saw this little child rushing towards the house, she saw my shining eyes, and instead of getting mad at me, "How dare you go off without telling anyone where you've been, don't you dare do it again," which would have killed the excitement, she sat down to hear the wonderful story of how a hen lays an egg. So, if you look at that story with hindsight, isn't that the making of a little scientist? Curiosity, asking questions, not getting the answer you want, deciding to find out for yourself, making a mistake, not giving up, and having patience. It was all there. And the reason I bring that story up now is to say that had I had a different sort of mother, I might not be standing here now. But she encouraged this curiosity, she encouraged this love of animals. She realized I would learn to read more quickly if she found books that interested me. So I got books about animals, and then I suppose I was about 7 when I met Dr. Dolittle. And if there's anybody here who hasn't met Dr. Dolittle, then go and get a Dr. Dolittle book. And this English doctor who learned the language of all the animals from his parrot Polynesia, the story that really fascinated me was when he took animals from a circus back to Africa on a boat. And that, I think, began my love affair with Africa. And then, at that time, we had very little money. We couldn't afford new books. We didn't have a motor car, nothing like that. World War II by this time was raging. And we didn't have, back then, there was no television. There was no internet, there was nothing like that. So we relied on learning from reading books, talking to people, and our own experience, like going out and learning about nature for ourselves. There was one second-hand bookshop that I loved. It had books higgledy-piggledy all over the place, and the old man really didn't know what he had, so you could get great bargains. And on this one day, I found a little book. It was about this big, and I just had enough money for it. And I took it home, and although we had very little money, we were in my grandmother's house at this point, and that house had a big garden. And my uncle, who was a surgeon, paid the mortgage. So we had this lovely garden with trees. That was another lucky thing of my childhood. And I took this little book up my favorite beech tree, and I read it from cover to cover. And that little book, which I still have today, was called Tarzan of the Apes. So, of course, being a romantically minded little girl, I felt passionately in love with this glorious man who was living out in the forest with the animals, as I wanted to do. And what did he do? He married the wrong Jane. So I was very jealous. But at any rate, that was when the dream began. I would grow up, go to Africa, live with animals and write books about them. I had no dream of being a scientist back then. When I left school, most of my friends went to college, university, but we couldn't afford it, and you couldn't get a scholarship unless you were good in a foreign language, and I wasn't. So again, my mother said, do a secretarial course, we've just got enough money for that, and then perhaps you can get a job in Africa. So wise woman that she was, I got this job in London with documentary films, and then came a letter from a school friend inviting me to Africa for a holiday. All the time since I had my dream, everybody had laughed at me. How would I get to Africa with no money? Africa was the dark continent, and I was the wrong sex. I was just a girl. But the one person who never laughed at me had been my mother, who used to say, Jane, if you really want something, then you're going to have to work hard and take advantage of opportunity and never give up. So there was the opportunity, the invitation to Kenya from a school friend. Had to work very hard as a waitress to earn the money. Eventually, when I was 23, I had saved up enough money to go out to Kenya by boat, because that was the cheapest. So 23 years old, bye-bye to family, friends and country, and going off on that amazing adventure. But today, young girls of 23, it's normal to go off on an adventure like that, but back then it wasn't. And my mother was accused of being totally irresponsible. But she supported me, she let me go, and there, when I stayed with my friend, I got a job in Nairobi and heard about and subsequently met my mentor, Dr. Leakey. The Leakey who spent his life searching for the fossilized remains of our Stone Age ancestors. I went to see him at the Natural History Museum in Nairobi. I remember him asking me questions about all the creatures that were stuffed or pickled in the museum. And I think he was really impressed that this young girl, straight from England with no college degree, could answer so many of his questions. So he gave me a job, yes, first as his secretary. And then that led, as he realized that I was the person he'd been looking for several years, to go and study the behavior of chimpanzees.